Chapter 1 of The Human Machine. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ruth Golding. The Human Machine by Arnold Bennett. Chapter 1. Taking oneself for granted. There are men who are capable of loving a machine more deeply than they can love a woman. They are among the happiest men on earth. This is not a sneer meanly shot from cover at women. It is simply a statement of notorious fact. Men who worry themselves to distraction over the perfecting of a machine are indubitably blessed beyond their kind. Most of us have known such men. Yesterday they were constructing motor cars, but to-day aeroplanes are in the air, or at any rate they ought to be, according to the inventors. Watch the inventors. Invention is not usually their principal business. They must invent in their spare time. They must invent before breakfast, invent in the Strand between Lyons's and the office, invent after dinner, invent on Sundays. See with what ardour they rush home of a night. See how they seize a half-holiday like hungry dogs a bone. They don't want golf, bridge, limericks, novels, illustrated magazines, clubs, whisky, starting prices, hints about neckties, political meetings, yarns, comic songs, and Turic salts, nor the smiles that are situate between a gay corsage and a picture hat. They never wonder at a loss what they will do next. Their evenings never drag, are always too short. You may, indeed, catch them at 12 o'clock at night on the flat of their backs, but not in bed. No, in a shed, under a machine, holding a candle whose paths drop fatness up to the connecting rod that is strained, or the wheel that is out of centre. They are continually interested, nay, enthralled. They have a machine, and they are perfecting it. They get one part right, and then another goes wrong, and they get that right, and then another goes wrong, and so on. When they are quite sure they have reached perfection, forth issues the machine out of the shed, and in 5 minutes is smashed up, together with a limb or so of the inventors, just because they had been quite sure too soon. Then the whole business starts again. They do not give up. That particular wreck was, of course, due to a mere oversight. The whole business starts again. For they have glimpsed perfection. They have the gleam of perfection in their souls. Thus their lives run away. They will never fly, you remark cynically. Well, if they don't. Besides, what about right? With all your cynicism, have you never envied them their machine and their passionate interest in it? You know, perhaps, the moment when, brushing in front of the glass, you detected your first grey hair. You stopped brushing. Then you resumed brushing hastily. You pretended not to be shocked. But you were. Perhaps you know a more disturbing moment than that. The moment when it suddenly occurred to you that you had arrived as far as you ever will arrive, and you had realized as much of your early dream as you ever will realize, and the realization was utterly unlike the dream. The marriage was excessively prosaic and eternal, not at all what you expected it to be, and your illusions were dissipated, and games and hobbies had an unpleasant core of tedium and futility, and the ideal tobacco mixture did not exist, and one literary masterpiece resembled another, and all the days that are to come will more or less resemble the present day until you die, and in an illuminating flash You understood what all those people were driving at when they wrote such unconscionably long letters to the telegraph as to life being worth living or not worth living, and there was naught to be done but face the grey, monotonous future and pretend to be cheerful, with the worm of ennui gnawing at your heart. In a word, the moment when it occurred to you that yours is the common lot. In that moment, have you not wished, do you not continually wish, for an exhaustless machine, a machine that you could never get to the end of? Would you not give your head to be lying on the flat of your back, peering with a candle, dirty, foiled, catching cold, but absorbed in the pursuit of an object? Have you not gloomily regretted that you were born without a mechanical turn, because there is really something about a machine? It has never struck you that you do possess a machine. Oh, blind! Oh, dull! It has never struck you that you have at hand a machine wonderful beyond all mechanisms in sheds, intricate, delicately adjustable, of astounding and miraculous possibilities, interminably interesting. That machine is yourself. "This fellow is preaching. I won't have it," you exclaim resentfully. Dear sir, I am not preaching, and even if I were, I think you would have it. I think I can anyhow keep hold of your button for a while, though you pull hard. I am not preaching. I am simply bent on calling your attention to a fact which has perhaps wholly or partially escaped you, namely, that you are the most fascinating bit of machinery that ever was. You do yourself less than justice. It is said that men are only interested in themselves. The truth is that as a rule men are interested in every mortal thing except themselves. They have a habit of taking themselves for granted, and that habit is responsible for 9/10 of the boredom and despair on the face of the planet. A man will wake up in the middle of the night, usually owing to some form of delightful excess, and his brain will be very active indeed for a space ere he can go to sleep again. In that candid hour, after the exaltation of the evening and before the hope of the dawn, he will see everything in its true colours except himself. There is nothing like a sleepless couch for a clear vision of one's environment. He will see all his wife's faults and the hopelessness of trying to cure them. He will momentarily see, though with less sharpness of outline, his own faults. He will probably decide that the anxieties of children outweigh the joys connected with children. He will admit all the shortcomings of existence, will face them like a man, grimly, sourly, in a sturdy despair. He will mutter, "Of course I'm angry. Who wouldn't be? Of course I'm disappointed. Did I expect this 20 years ago? Yes, we ought to save more, but we don't, so there you are. I'm bound to worry. I know I should be better if I didn't smoke so much. I know there's absolutely no sense at all in taking liqueurs. Absurd to be ruffled with her when she's in one of her moods. I don't have enough exercise. Can't be regular somehow. Not the slightest use hoping that things will be different, because I know they won't. Queer world. Never really what you may call happy, you know. Now, if things were different," he loses consciousness. Observe, he has taken himself for granted, just glancing at his faults and looking away again. It is his environment that has occupied his attention, and his environment, things that he would wish to have different. Did he not know, out of the fullness of experience, that it is futile to desire such a change? What he wants is a pipe that won't put itself into his mouth, a glass that won't leap of its own accord to his lips, money that won't slip untouched out of his pocket, legs that without asking will carry him certain miles every day in the open air, habits that practise themselves, a wife that will expand and contract according to his humours, like a Wernicke bookcase, always complete but never finished. Wise man, he perceives at once that he can't have these things, and so he resigns himself to the universe and settles down to a permanent, restrained discontent. No one shall say he is unreasonable. You see, he has given no attention to the machine. Let us not call it a flying machine. Let us call it simply an automobile. There it is on the road, jolting, screeching, rattling, perfuming, and there he is saying, "This road ought to be as smooth as velvet. That hill in front is ridiculous, and the descent on the other side positively dangerous. And it's all turns. I can't see 100 yards in front." He has a wild idea of trying to force the County Council to sandpaper the road, or of employing the new Territorial Army to remove the hill. But he dismisses that idea. He is so reasonable. He accepts all. He sits clothed in reasonableness on the machine, and accepts all. "Ass!" you exclaim. "Why doesn't he get down and inflate that tyre, for one thing? Any one can see the sparking apparatus is wrong, and it's perfectly certain the gear box wants oil. Why doesn't he—" I will tell you why he doesn't. Just because he isn't aware that he is on a machine at all. He has never examined what he is on. And at the back of his consciousness is a dim idea that he is perched on a piece of solid, immutable rock that runs on casters. End of chapter 1. Of the Human Machine by Arnold Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 2. Amateurs in the Art of Living. Considering that we have to spend the whole of our lives in this human machine, considering that it is our sole means of contact and compromise with the rest of the world, we really do devote to it very little attention. When I say we, I mean our inmost spirits, the instinctive part, the mystery within that exists. And when I say the human machine, I mean the brain and the body, and chiefly the brain. The expression of the soul by means of the brain and body is what we call the art of living. We certainly do not learn this art at school to any appreciable extent. At school we are taught that it is necessary to fling our arms and legs to and fro for so many hours per diem. We are also shown practically that our brains are capable of performing certain useful tricks, and that if we do not compel our brains to perform those tricks we shall suffer. Thus one day we run home and proclaim to our delighted parents that 11/12s are 132, a feat of the brain. So it goes on until our parents begin to look up to us because we can chatter of cosines or sketch the foreign policy of Louis XIV. Good, but not a word about the principles of the art of living yet. Only a few detached rules from our parents, to be blindly followed when particular crises supervene. And indeed it would be absurd to talk to a schoolboy about the expression of his soul. He would probably mutter a monosyllable which is not mice. Of course, school is merely a preparation for living, unless one goes to a university, in which case it is a preparation for university. One is supposed to turn one's attention to living when these preliminaries are over, say at the age of about 20. Assuredly one lives then. There is, however, nothing new in that, for one has been living all the time, in a fashion. All the time one has been using the machine without understanding it. But does one, school and college being over, enter upon a study of the machine? Not a bit. The question then becomes not how to live, but how to obtain and retain a position in which one will be able to live, how to get minute portions of dead animals and plants which one can swallow in order not to die of hunger, how to acquire and constantly renew a stock of other portions of dead animals and plants in which one can envelop oneself in order not to die of cold, how to procure the exclusive right of entry into certain huts where one may sleep and eat without being rained upon by the clouds of heaven, and so forth. And when one has realized this ambition, there comes the desire to be able to double the operation, and do it not for oneself alone, but for oneself and another, marriage. But no scientific sustained attention is yet given to the real business of living, of smooth intercourse, of self-expression, of conscious adaptation to environment, in brief, to the study of the machine. At 30, the chances are that a man will understand better the draught of a chimney than his own respiratory apparatus, to name one of the simple, obvious things. And as for understanding the working of his own brain, what an idea! As for the skill to avoid the waste of power involved by friction in the business of living, do we give an hour to it in a month? Do we ever at all examine it, save in an amateurish and clumsy fashion? A young lady produces a water-colour drawing. Very nice, we say, and add to ourselves, for an amateur. But our living is more amateurish than that young lady's drawing, though surely we ought every one of us to be professionals at living. When we have been engaged in the preliminaries to living for about 55 years, we begin to think about slacking off. Up till this period, our reason for not having scientifically studied the art of living, the perfecting and use of the finer parts of the machine, is not that we have lacked leisure, most of us have enormous heaps of leisure, but that we have simply been too absorbed in the preliminaries, have, in fact, treated the preliminaries to the business as the business itself. Then, at 55, we ought at last to begin to live our lives with professional skill, as a professional painter paints pictures. Yes, but we can't. It is too late then. Neither painters, nor acrobats, nor any professionals can be formed at the age of 55. Thus we finish our lives amateurishly, as we have begun them. And when the machine creaks and sets our teeth on edge, or refuses to obey the steering wheel and deposits us in the ditch, we say, "Can't be helped," or "Doesn't matter, it will all be the same 100 years hence," or "I must make the best of things." And we try to believe that in accepting the status quo we have justified the status quo, and all the time we feel our insincerity. You exclaim that I exaggerate. I do. To force into prominence an aspect of affairs usually overlooked, it is absolutely necessary to exaggerate. Poetic licence is one name for this kind of exaggeration. But I exaggerate very little indeed, much less than perhaps you think. I know that you are going to point out to me that vast numbers of people regularly spend a considerable portion of their leisure in striving after self-improvement. Granted, and I am glad of it. But I should be gladder if their strivings bore more closely upon the daily business of living, of self-expression without friction and without futile desires. See this man who regularly studies every evening of his life. He has genuinely understood the nature of poetry, and his taste is admirable. He recites verse with true feeling, and may be said to be highly cultivated. Poetry is a continual source of pleasure to him. True. But why is he always complaining about not receiving his deserts in the office? Why is he worried about finance? Why does he so often sulk with his wife? Why does he persist in eating more than his digestion will tolerate? It was not written in the book of fate that he should complain and worry and sulk and suffer. And if he was a professional at living, he would not do these things. There is no reason why he should do them, except the reason that he has never learnt his business, never studied the human machine as a whole, never really thought rationally about living. Supposing you encountered an automobilist who was swerving and grinding all over the road, and you stopped to ask what was the matter, and he replied, "Never mind what's the matter. Just look at my lovely acetylene lamps, how they shine, and how I've polished them." You would not regard him as a Clifford Earp, or even as an entirely sane man. So with our student of poetry. It is indubitable that a large amount of what is known as self-improvement is simply self-indulgence, a form of pleasure which only incidentally improves a particular part of the machine, and even that to the neglect of far more important parts. My aim is to direct a man's attention to himself as a whole, considered as a machine, complex and capable of quite extraordinary efficiency, for travelling through this world smoothly, in any desired manner, with satisfaction not only to himself, but to the people he meets en route, and the people who are overtaking him, and whom he is overtaking. My aim is to show that only an inappreciable fraction of our ordered and sustained efforts is given to the business of actual living, as distinguished from the preliminaries to living. End of chapter 2. Three of The Human Machine by Arnold Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3. The Brain as a Gentleman at Large. It is not as if in this business of daily living we were seriously hampered by ignorance, either as to the results which we ought to obtain, or as to the general means which we must employ in order to obtain them. With all our absorption in the mere preliminaries to living, and all our carelessness about living itself, we arrive pretty soon at a fairly accurate notion of what satisfactory living is, and we perceive with some clearness the methods necessary to success. I have pictured the man who wakes up in the middle of the night and sees the horrid semi-fiasco of his life. But let me picture the man who wakes up refreshed early on a fine summer morning and looks into his mind with the eyes of hope and experience, not experience and despair. That man will pass a delightful half hour in thinking upon the scheme of the universe as it affects himself. He is quite clear that contentment depends on his own acts, and that no power can prevent him from performing those acts. He plans everything out, and before he gets up he knows precisely what he must and will do in certain foreseen crises and junctures. He sincerely desires to live efficiently. Who would wish to make a daily mess of existence? And he knows the way to realize the desire. And yet, mark me, that man will not have been an hour on his feet on this difficult earth before the machine has unmistakably gone wrong. The machine which was designed to do this work of living, which is capable of doing it thoroughly well, but which has not been put into order. What is the use of consulting the map of life, and tracing the itinerary, and getting the machine out of the shed, and making a start, if half the nuts are loose, or the steering pillar is twisted, or there is no petrol in the tank? Having asked this question, I will drop the mechanico-vehicular comparison, which is too rough and crude for the delicacy of the subject. Where has the human machine gone wrong? It has gone wrong in the brain. What, is he wrong in the head? Most assuredly, most strictly. He knows, none better, that when his wife employs a particular tone containing 10 grains of asperity, and he replies in a particular tone containing 11 grains, the consequences will be explosive. He knows, on the other hand, that if he replies in a tone containing only 1 little drop of honey, the consequences may not be unworthy of 2 reasonable beings. He knows this. His brain is fully instructed. And lo, his brain, while arguing that women are really too absurd, as if that was the point, is sending down orders to the muscles of the throat and mouth which result in at least 11 grains of asperity, and conjugal relations are endangered for the day. He didn't want to do it. His desire was not to do it. He despises himself for doing it. But his brain was not in working order. His brain ran away, raced on its own account, against reason, against desire, against morning resolves. And there he is. That is just one example of the simplest and slightest. Examples can be multiplied. The man may be a young man whose immediate future depends on his passing an examination which he is capable of passing on his head, which nothing can prevent him from passing, if only his brain will not be so absurd as to give orders to his legs to walk out of the house towards the tennis court, instead of sending them upstairs to the study. If only, having once safely lodged him in the study, his brain will devote itself to the pages of books, instead of dwelling on the image of a nice girl, not at all like other girls. Or the man may be an old man who will live in perfect comfort, if only his brain will not interminably run round and round in a circle of grievances, apprehensions, and fears, which no amount of contemplation can destroy or even ameliorate. The brain, that is the seat of trouble. Well, you say, of course it is. We all know that. We don't act as if we did, anyway. Give us more brains, Lord, ejaculated a great writer. Personally, I think he would have been wiser if he had asked first for the power to keep in order such brains as we have. We indubitably possess quite enough brains, quite as much as we can handle. The supreme muddlers of living are often people of quite remarkable intellectual faculty, with a quite remarkable gift of being wise for others. The pity is that our brains have a way of wandering, as it is politely called. Brain wandering is indeed now recognised as a specific disease. I wonder what you, O business man with an office in Ludgate Circus, would say to your office boy, whom you had dispatched on an urgent message to Westminster, and whom you found larking around Euston Station when you rushed to catch your week-end train. "Please, sir, I started to go to Westminster, but there's something funny in my limbs that makes me go up all manner of streets. I can't help it, sir." "Can't you?" you would say. "Well, you had better go and be somebody else's office boy." Your brain is something worse than that office boy, something more insidiously potent for evil. I conceive the brain of the average well-intentioned man as possessing the tricks and manners of one of those gentlemen at large who, having nothing very urgent to do, stroll along and offer their services gratis to some short-handed work of philanthropy. They will commonly demoralise and disorganise the business conduct of an affair in about a fortnight. They come when they like, they go when they like. Sometimes they are exceedingly industrious and obedient, but then there is an even chance that they will shirk and follow their own sweet will. and they mustn't be spoken to or pulled up, for have they not kindly volunteered, and are they not giving their days for naught? These persons are the bane of the enterprises in which they condescend to meddle. Now, there is a vast deal too much of the gentleman at large about one's brain. One's brain has no right whatever to behave as a gentleman at large, but it in fact does. It forgets. It flatly ignores orders. At the critical moment when pressure is highest, it simply lights a cigarette and goes out for a walk. And we meekly sit down under this behaviour. "I didn't feel like stewing," says the young man who, against his wish, will fail in his examination. "The words were out of my mouth before I knew it," says the husband whose wife is a woman. "I couldn't get any inspiration to-day," says the artist. "I can't resist, Stilton," says the fellow who is dying of greed. "One can't help one's thoughts," says the old worrier. And this last really voices the secret excuse of all five. And you all say to me, "My brain is myself. How can I alter myself? I was born like that." In the first place, you were not born like that. You have lapsed to that. And in the second place, your brain is not yourself. It is only a part of yourself, and not the highest seat of authority. Do you love your mother, wife, or children with your brain? Do you desire with your brain? Do you, in a word, ultimately and essentially live with your brain? No. Your brain is an instrument. The proof that it is an instrument lies in the fact that when extreme necessity urges, you can command your brain to do certain things, and it does them. The first of the two great principles which underlie the efficiency of the human machine is this: the brain is a servant, exterior to the central force of the ego. If it is out of control, the reason is not that it is uncontrollable, but merely that its discipline has been neglected. The brain can be trained, as the hand and eye can be trained. It can be made as obedient as a sporting dog, and by similar methods. In the meantime, the indispensable preparation for brain discipline is to form the habit of regarding one's brain as an instrument exterior to one's self, like a tongue or a foot. End of chapter 3. Four of the Human Machine by Arnold Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 4. The First Practical Step. The brain is a highly quaint organism. Let me say at once, lest I should be cannonaded by physiologists, psychologists, or metaphysicians, that by the brain I mean the faculty which reasons and which gives orders to the muscles. I mean exactly what the plain man means by the brain. The brain is the diplomatist which arranges relations between our instinctive self and the universe, and it fulfils its mission when it provides for the maximum of freedom to the instincts with the minimum of friction. It argues with the instincts. It takes them on one side and points out the unwisdom of certain performances. It catches them by the coat-tails when they are about to make fools of themselves. "Don't drink all that iced champagne at a draught," it says to one instinct. "We may die of it." "Don't catch that rude fellow one in the eye," it says to another instinct. "He is more powerful than us." It is, in fact, a majestic spectacle of common sense. And yet it has the most extraordinary lapses. It is just like that man, we all know him and consult him, who is a continual fount of excellent, sagacious advice on everything, but who somehow cannot bring his sagacity to bear on his own personal career. In the matter of its own special activities, the brain is usually undisciplined and unreliable. We never know what it will do next. We give it some work to do, say, as we are walking along the street to the office. Perhaps it has to devise some scheme for making £150 suffice for £200. Or perhaps it has to plan out the heads of a very important letter. We meet a pretty woman, and away that undisciplined, sagacious brain runs after her, dropping the scheme or the draft letter, and amusing itself with aspirations or regrets for half an hour, sometimes a day. The serious part of our instinctive self feebly remonstrates, but without effect. Or it may be that we have suffered a great disappointment, which is definite and hopeless. Will the brain, like a sensible creature, leave that disappointment alone, and instead of living in the past, live in the present or the future? Not it. Though it knows perfectly well that it is wasting its time, and casting a very painful and utterly unnecessary gloom over itself and us, it can so little control its unhealthy, morbid appetite that no expostulations will induce it to behave rationally. Or perhaps, after a confabulation with the soul, it has been decided that when next a certain harmful instinct comes into play, the brain shall firmly interfere. "Yes," says the brain, "I really will watch that." But when the moment arrives, is the brain on the spot? The brain has probably forgotten the affair entirely, or remembered it too late, or sighs as the victorious instinct knocks it on the head, "Well, next time." All this, and much more that every reader can supply from his own exciting souvenirs, is absurd and ridiculous on the part of the brain. It is a conclusive proof that the brain is out of condition, idle as a nigger, capricious as an actor-manager, and eaten to the core with loose habits. Therefore the brain must be put into training. It is the most important part of the human machine by which the soul expresses and develops itself, and it must learn good habits. And primarily it must be taught obedience. Obedience can only be taught by imposing one's will, by the sheer force of volition. And the brain must be mastered by will-power. The beginning of wise living lies in the control of the brain by the will, so that the brain may act according to the precepts which the brain itself gives. With an obedient, disciplined brain, a man may live always right up to the standard of his best moments. To teach a child obedience, you tell it to do something, and you see that that something is done. The same with the brain. Here is the foundation of an efficient life, and the antidote for the tendency to make a fool of oneself. It is marvellously simple. Say to your brain, "From 9 o'clock to 9:30 this morning, you must dwell without ceasing on a particular topic which I will give you." Now, it doesn't matter what this topic is. The point is to control and invigorate the brain by exercise. But you may just as well give it a useful topic to think over as a futile one. You might give it this: "My brain is my servant. I am not the plaything of my brain." Let it concentrate on these statements for 30 minutes. "What?" you cry. "Is this the way to an efficient life? Why, there's nothing in it." Simple as it may appear, this is the way, and it is the only way. As for there being nothing in it, try it. I guarantee that you will fail to keep your brain concentrated on the given idea for 30 seconds, let alone 30 minutes. you will find your brain conducting itself in a manner which would be comic were it not tragic. Your first experiments will result in disheartening failure, for to exact from the brain at will and by will concentration on a given idea for even so short a period as half an hour is an exceedingly difficult feat, and a fatiguing. It needs perseverance. It needs a terrible obstinacy on the part of the will. That brain of yours will be hopping about all over the place, and every time it hops you must bring it back by force to its original position. You must absolutely compel it to ignore every idea except the one which you have selected for its attention. You cannot hope to triumph all at once, but you can hope to triumph. There is no royal road to the control of the brain. There is no patent dodge about it, and no complicated function which a plain person may not comprehend. It is simply a question of I will, and I will. Italics here are indispensable. Let me resume. Efficient living, living up to one's best standard, getting the last ounce of power out of the machine with the minimum of friction, these things depend on the disciplined and vigorous condition of the brain. The brain can be disciplined by learning the habit of obedience, and it can learn the habit of obedience by the practice of concentration. Disciplinary concentration, though nothing could have the air of being simpler, is the basis of the whole structure. This fact must be grasped imaginatively. It must be seen and felt. The more regularly concentration is practised, the more firmly will the imagination grasp the effects of it, both direct and indirect. After but a few days of honest trying in the exercise which I have indicated, you will perceive its influence. You will grow accustomed to the idea, at first strange in its novelty, of the brain being external to the supreme force which is you, and in subjection to that force. You will, as a not very distant possibility, see yourself in possession of the power to switch your brain on and off in a particular subject, as you switch electricity on and off in a particular room. The brain will get used to the straight paths of obedience, and, a remarkable phenomenon, it will, by the mere practice of obedience, become less forgetful and more effective. It will not so frequently give way to an instinct that takes it by surprise. In a word, it will have received a general tonic. With a brain that is improving every day, you can set about the perfecting of the machine in a scientific manner. End of chapter 4. The Human Machine by Arnold Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 5. Habit Forming by Concentration. As soon as the will has got the upper hand of the brain, as soon as it can say to the brain with a fair certainty of being obeyed, "Do this," think along these lines, and continue to do so without wandering until I give you leave to stop. Then is the time arrived when the perfecting of the human machine may be undertaken in a large and comprehensive spirit, as a city council undertakes the purification and reconstruction of a city. The tremendous possibilities of an obedient brain will be perceived immediately we begin to reflect upon what we mean by our character. Now, a person's character is, and can be, nothing else but the total result of his habits of thought. A person is benevolent because he habitually thinks benevolently. A person is idle because his thoughts dwell habitually on the instant pleasures of idleness. It is true that everybody is born with certain predispositions, and that these predispositions influence very strongly the early formation of habits of thought. But the fact remains that the character is built by long continued habits of thought. If the mature edifice of character usually shows in an exaggerated form the peculiarities of the original predisposition, this merely indicates a probability that the slow erection of the edifice has proceeded at haphazard, and that reason has not presided over it. A child may be born with a tendency to bent shoulders. If nothing is done, if, on the contrary, he becomes a clerk and abhors gymnastics, his shoulders will develop an excessive roundness entirely through habit. Whereas if his will, guided by his reason, had compelled the formation of a corrective physical habit, his shoulders might have been, if not quite straight, nearly so. Thus a physical habit, the same with a mental habit. The more closely we examine the development of original predispositions, the more clearly we shall see that this development is not inevitable, is not a process which works itself out independently according to mysterious, ruthless laws which we cannot understand. For instance, the effect of an original predisposition may be destroyed by an accidental shock. A young man with an inherited tendency to alcohol may develop into a stern teetotaler through the shock caused by seeing his drunken father strike his mother. Whereas, if his father had chanced to be affectionate in drink, the son might have ended in the gutter. No ruthless law here. It is notorious also that natures are sometimes completely changed in their development by chance momentary contact with natures stronger than themselves. "From that day I resolved," etc. You know the phrase. Often the resolve is not kept, but often it is kept. A spark has inflamed the will. The burning will has tyrannized over the brain. New habits have been formed, and the result looks just like a miracle. Now, if these great transformations can be brought about by accident, cannot similar transformations be brought about by a reasonable design? At any rate, if one starts to bring them about, one starts with the assurance that transformations are not impossible, since they have occurred. One starts also in the full knowledge of the influence of habit on life. Take any one of your own habits, mental or physical. You will be able to recall the time when that habit did not exist, or if it did exist, it was scarcely perceptible. And you will discover that nearly all your habits have been formed unconsciously, by daily repetitions which bore no relation to a general plan, and which you practised not noticing. You will be compelled to admit that your character, as it is today, is a structure that has been built almost without the aid of an architect, higgledy-piggledy, anyhow. But occasionally the architect did step in and design something. Here and there among your habits you will find one that you consciously and of deliberate purpose initiated and persevered with, doubtless owing to some happy influence. What is the difference between that conscious habit and the unconscious habits? None whatever as regards its effect on the sum of your character. It may be the strongest of all your habits. The only quality that differentiates it from the others is that it has a definite object, most likely a good object, and that it wholly or partially fulfils that object. There is not a man who reads these lines but has, in this detail or that, proved in himself that the will, forcing the brain to repeat the same action again and again, can modify the shape of his character as a sculptor modifies the shape of damp clay. But if a grown man's character is developing from day to day, as it is, if 9/10 of the development is due to unconscious action and 1/10 to conscious action, and if the 1/10 conscious is the most satisfactory part of the total result, why, in the name of common sense, henceforward should not 9/10 instead of 1/10 be due to conscious action? What is there to prevent this agreeable consummation? There is nothing whatever to prevent it, except insubordination on the part of the brain. And insubordination of the brain can be cured, as I have previously shown. When I see men unhappy and inefficient in the craft of living from sheer crass inattention to their own development, when I see misshapen men building up businesses and empires and never stopping to build up themselves, when I see dreary men expending precisely the same energy on teaching a dog to walk on its hind legs as would brighten the whole colour of their own lives, I feel as if I wanted to give up the ghost, so ridiculous, so fatuous does the spectacle seem. But, of course, I do not give up the ghost. The paroxysm passes. Only I really must cry out, "Can't you see what you're missing? Can't you see that you're missing the most interesting thing on earth, far more interesting than businesses, empires, and dogs? Doesn't it strike you how clumsy and short-sighted you are, working always with an inferior machine when you might have a smooth gliding perfection? Doesn't it strike you how badly you are treating yourself? Listen, you confirmed grumbler, you who make the evening meal hideous with complaints against destiny, for it is you I will single out. Are you aware what people are saying about you behind your back? They are saying that you render yourself and your family miserable by the habit which has grown on you of always grumbling. Surely it isn't as bad as that, you protest. Yes, it is just as bad as that. You say, the fact is, I know it's absurd to grumble, but I'm like that. I've tried to stop it and I can't. How have you tried to stop it? Well, I've made up my mind several times to fight against it, but I never succeed. This is strictly between ourselves. I don't usually admit that I'm a grumbler. Considering that you grumble for about an hour and a half every day of your life, it was sanguine, my dear sir, to expect to cure such a habit by means of a solitary intention, formed at intervals in the brain and then forgotten. No, you must do more than that. If you will daily fix your brain firmly for half an hour on the truth, you know it to be a truth, that grumbling is absurd and futile, your brain will henceforward begin to form a habit in that direction. It will begin to be moulded to the idea that grumbling is absurd and futile. In odd moments, when it isn't thinking of anything in particular, it will suddenly remember that grumbling is absurd and futile. When you sit down to the meal and open your mouth to say, "I can't think what my ass of a partner means by," it will remember that grumbling is absurd and futile, and will alter the arrangement of your throat, teeth, and tongue, so that you will say, "What fine weather we're having." In brief, it will remember involuntarily, by a new habit. All who look into their experience will admit that the failure to replace old habits by new ones is due to the fact that at the critical moment the brain does not remember, it simply forgets. The practice of concentration will cure that. All depends on regular concentration. This grumbling is an instance, though chosen not quite at hazard. End of chapter 5. Of the Human Machine by Arnold Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 6. Lord over the Nodle. Having proved by personal experiment the truth of the first of the two great principles which concern the human machine, namely that the brain is a servant, not a master, and can be controlled, we may now come to the second. The second is more fundamental than the first, but it can be of no use until the first is understood and put into practice. The human machine is an apparatus of brain and muscle for enabling the ego to develop freely in the universe by which it is surrounded, without friction. Its function is to convert the facts of the universe to the best advantage of the ego. The facts of the universe are the material with which it is its business to deal, not the facts of an ideal universe, but the facts of this universe. Hence, when friction occurs, when the facts of the universe cease to be of advantage to the ego, the fault is in the machine. It is not the solar system that has gone wrong, but the human machine. Second great principle, therefore, in case of friction, the machine is always at fault. You can control nothing but your own mind. Even your 2-year-old babe may defy you by the instinctive force of its personality. But your own mind you can control. Your own mind is a sacred enclosure into which nothing harmful can enter except by your permission. Your own mind has the power to transmute every external phenomenon to its own purposes. If happiness arises from cheerfulness, kindliness, and rectitude, and who will deny it, what possible combination of circumstances is going to make you unhappy so long as the machine remains in order? If self-development consists in the utilization of one's environment, not utilization of somebody else's environment, how can your environment prevent you from developing? You would look rather foolish without it, anyway. In that nodle of yours is everything necessary for development, for the maintaining of dignity, for the achieving of happiness, and you are absolute lord over the nodle, will you but exercise the powers of lordship. Why worry about the contents of somebody else's nodle, in which you can be nothing but an intruder, when you may arrive at a better result, with absolute certainty, by confining your activities to your own? Look within. The kingdom of heaven is within you. "Oh, yes," you protest, "all that's old. Epictetus said that. Marcus Aurelius said that. Christ said that." They did. I admit it readily. But if you were ruffled this morning because your motor omnibus broke down and you had to take a cab, then, so far as you are concerned, these great teachers lived in vain. You, calling yourself a reasonable man, are going about dependent for your happiness, dignity, and growth upon 1,000 things over which you have no control, and the most exquisitely organized machine for ensuring happiness, dignity, and growth is rusting away inside you. And all because you have a sort of notion that a saying said 2,000 years ago cannot be practical. You remark sagely to your child, "No, my child, you cannot have that moon," and you will accomplish nothing by crying for it. Now here is this beautiful box of bricks, by means of which you may amuse yourself, while learning many wonderful matters and improving your mind. You must try to be content with what you have, and to make the best of it. If you had the moon, you wouldn't be any happier. Then you lie awake half the night repining because the last post has brought a letter to the effect that "the board cannot entertain your application for," etc. You say the two cases are not alike. They are not. Your child has never heard of Epictetus. On the other hand, justice is the moon. At your age you surely know that. "But the directors ought to have granted my application," you insist. Exactly. I agree. But we are not in a universe of oughts. You have a special apparatus within you for dealing with a universe where oughts are flagrantly disregarded, and you are not using it. You are lying awake, keeping your wife awake, injuring your health, injuring hers, losing your dignity and your cheerfulness. Why? Because you think that these antics and performances will influence the board. Because you think that they will put you into a better condition for dealing with your environment tomorrow. Not a bit. Simply because the machine is at fault. In certain cases we do make use of our machines, as well as their sad condition of neglect will allow, but in other cases we behave in an extraordinarily irrational manner. Thus, if we sally out and get caught in a heavy shower, we do not, unless very far gone in foolishness, sit down and curse the weather. We put up our umbrella if we have one, and if not, we hurry home. We may grumble, but it is not serious grumbling. We accept the shower as a fact of the universe and control ourselves. Thus, also, if by a sudden catastrophe we lose somebody who is important to us, we grieve, but we control ourselves, recognizing one of those hazards of destiny from which not even millionaires are exempt. And the result on our ego is usually to improve it in essential respects. But there are other strokes of destiny, other facts of the universe, against which we protest as a child protests when deprived of the moon. Take the case of an individual with an imperfect idea of honesty. Now, that individual is the consequence of his father and mother and his environment, and his father and mother of theirs, and so backwards to the single-celled protoplasm. That individual is a result of the cosmic order, the inevitable product of cause and effect. We know that. We must admit that he is just as much a fact of the universe as a shower of rain or a storm at sea that swallows a ship. We freely grant in the abstract that there must be, at the present stage of evolution, a certain number of persons with unfair minds. We are quite ready to contemplate such an individual with philosophy, until it happens that, in the course of the progress of the solar system, he runs up against ourselves. Then listen to the outcry. Listen to the continual explosions of a righteous man aggrieved. The individual may be our clerk, cashier, son, father, brother, partner, wife, employer. We are ill-used. We are being treated unfairly. We kick. We scream. We nourish the inward sense of grievance that eats the core out of content. We sit down in the rain. We decline to think of umbrellas or to run to shelter. We care not that that individual is a fact which the universe has been slowly manufacturing for millions of years. Our attitude implies that we want eternity to roll back and begin again in such wise that we, at any rate, shall not be disturbed. Though we have a machine for the transmutation of facts into food for our growth, we do not dream of using it. But, we say, he is doing us harm. Where? In our minds. He has robbed us of our peace, our comfort, our happiness, our good temper. Even if he has, we might just as well inveigh against a shower. But has he? What was our brain doing while this naughty person stepped in and robbed us of the only possessions worth having? No, no. It is not that he has done us harm. The one cheerful item in a universe of stony facts is that no one can harm anybody except himself. It is merely that we have been silly, precisely as silly as if we had taken a seat in the rain with a folded umbrella by our side. The machine is at fault. I fancy we are now obtaining glimpses of what that phrase really means. End of chapter 6. Of the Human Machine by Arnold Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 7. What Living Chiefly Is. It is in intercourse, social, sentimental, or business, with one's fellows, that the qualities and the condition of the human machine are put to the test and strained. That part of my life which I conduct by myself, without reference, or at any rate without direct reference, to others, I can usually manage in such a way that the gods do not positively weep at the spectacle thereof. My environment is simpler, less puzzling, when I am alone, my calm and my self-control less liable to violent fluctuations. Impossible to be disturbed by a chair. Impossible that a chair should get on one's nerves. Impossible to blame a chair for not being as reasonable, as archangelic as I am myself. But when it comes to people, well, that is living then. The art of life, the art of extracting all its power from the human machine, does not lie chiefly in processes of bookish culture, nor in contemplations of the beauty and majesty of existence. It lies chiefly in keeping the peace, the whole peace, and nothing but the peace, with those with whom one is thrown. Is it in sitting ecstatic over Shelley, Shakespeare, or Herbert Spencer, solitary in my room of a night, that I am improving myself and learning to live? Or is it in watching over all my daily human contacts? Do not seek to escape the comparison by insinuating that I despise study, or by pointing out that the eternal verities are beyond dailiness. Nothing of the kind. I am so silly about books that merely to possess them gives me pleasure. And if the verities are good for eternity, they ought to be good for a day. If I cannot exchange them for daily coin, if I can't buy happiness for a single day because I've nothing less than an eternal verity about me and nobody has sufficient change, then my eternal verity is not an eternal verity. It is merely an unnegotiable bit of glass, called a diamond, or even a note on the bank of engraving. I can say to myself when I arise in the morning, I am master of my brain. No one can get in there and rage about like a bull in a china shop. If my companions on the planet's crust choose to rage about, they cannot affect me. I will not let them. I have power to maintain my own calm, and I will. No earthly being can force me to be false to my principles, or to be blind to the beauty of the universe, or to be gloomy, or to be irritable, or to complain against my lot. For these things depend on the brain. Cheerfulness, kindliness, and honest thinking are all within the department of the brain. The disciplined brain can accomplish them. And my brain is disciplined, and I will discipline it more and more as the days pass. I am, therefore, independent of hazard, and I will back myself to conduct all intercourse as becomes a rational creature. I can say this. I can ram this argument by force of will into my brain, and by dint of repeating it often enough, I shall assuredly arrive at the supreme virtues of reason. I should assuredly conquer, the brain being such a machine of habit, even if I did not take the trouble to consider in the slightest degree what manner of things my fellow men are, by acting merely in my own interests. But the way of perfection, I speak relatively, will be immensely shortened and smoothed if I do consider dispassionately the case of the other human machines. Thus, the truth is that my attitude towards my fellows is fundamentally and totally wrong, and that it entails on my thinking machine a strain which is quite unnecessary, though I may have arranged the machine so as to withstand the strain successfully. The secret of smooth living is a calm cheerfulness which will leave me always in full possession of my reasoning faculty, in order that I may live by reason instead of by instinct and momentary passion. The secret of calm cheerfulness is kindliness. No person can be consistently cheerful and calm who does not consistently think kind thoughts. But how can I be kindly when I pass the major portion of my time in blaming the people who surround me, who are part of my environment. If I, blaming, achieve some approach to kindliness, it is only by a great and exhausting effort of self-mastery. The inmost secret, then, lies in not blaming, in not judging and emitting verdicts. Oh, I do not blame by word of mouth. I am far too advanced for such a puerility. I keep the blame in my own breast, where it festers. I am always privately forgiving, which is bad for me, because, you know, there is nothing to forgive. I do not have to forgive bad weather, nor, if I found myself in an earthquake, should I have to forgive the earthquake. All blame, uttered or unexpressed, is wrong. I do not blame myself. I can explain myself to myself. I can invariably explain myself. If I forged a friend's name on a cheque, I should explain the affair quite satisfactorily to myself. And instead of blaming myself, I should sympathise with myself for having been driven into such an excessively awkward corner. Let me examine honestly my mental processes, and I must admit that my attitude towards others is entirely different from my attitude towards myself. I must admit that in the seclusion of my mind, though I say not a word, I am constantly blaming others because I am not happy. Whenever I bump up against an opposing personality and my smooth progress is impeded, I secretly blame the opposer. I act as though I had shouted to the world, "Clear out of the way, everyone, for I am coming." Everyone does not clear out of the way. I did not really expect everyone to clear out of the way, but I act within as though I had so expected. I blame. Hence kindliness, hence cheerfulness, is rendered vastly more difficult for me. What I ought to do is this. I ought to reflect again and again, and yet again, that the beings among whom I have to steer, the living environment out of which I have to manufacture my happiness, are just as inevitable in the scheme of evolution as I am myself, have just as much right to be themselves as I have to be myself, are precisely my equals in the face of nature, are capable of being explained as I am capable of being explained, are entitled to the same latitude as I am entitled to, and are no more responsible for their composition and their environment than I for mine. I ought to reflect again and again and yet again that they all deserve from me as much sympathy as I give to myself. Why not? Having thus reflected in a general manner, I ought to take one by one the individuals with whom I am brought into frequent contact, and seek, by a deliberate effort of the imagination and the reason, to understand them, to understand why they act thus and thus, what their difficulties are, what their explanation is, and how friction can be avoided. So I ought to reflect, morning after morning, until my brain is saturated with the cases of these individuals. Here is a course of discipline. If I follow it, I shall gradually lose the preposterous habit of blaming, and I shall have laid the foundations of that quiet, unshakable self-possession which is the indispensable preliminary of conduct according to reason, of thorough efficiency in the machine of happiness. But something in me, something distinctly base, says, "Yes, the put yourself in his place business over again. The do unto others business over again." Just so. Something in me is ashamed of being moral. You all know the feeling. Well, morals are naught but another name for reasonable conduct, a higher and more practical form of egotism, an egotism which, while freeing others, frees myself. I have tried the lower form of egotism, and it has failed. If I am afraid of being moral, if I prefer to cut off my nose to spite my face, well, I must accept the consequences. But truth will prevail. End of chapter 7. The Human Machine by Arnold Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 8. The Daily Friction. It is with common daily affairs that I am now dealing, not with heroic enterprises, ambitions, martyrdoms. Take the day, the ordinary day in the ordinary house or office. Though it comes 7 times a week, and is the most banal thing imaginable, it is quite worth attention. How does the machine get through it? The best that can be said of the machine is that it does get through it somehow. The friction, though seldom such as to bring matters to a standstill, is frequent. The sort of friction that, when it occurs in a bicycle, is just sufficient to annoy the rider, but not sufficient to make him get off the machine and examine the bearings. Occasionally the friction is very loud, indeed disturbing, and at rarer intervals it shrieks like an omnibus brake out of order. You know those days when you have the sensation that life is not large enough to contain the household or the office staff, when the business of intercourse may be compared to the manoeuvres of 2 people who, having awakened with a bad headache, are obliged to dress simultaneously in a very small bedroom. "After you with that towel," in accents of bitter, grinding politeness. "If you could kindly move your things off this chair," in a voice that would blow brains out if it were a bullet. I venture to say that you know those days. "But," you reply, "such days are few, usually." Well, usually the friction, though less intense, is still proceeding. We grow accustomed to it. We scarcely notice it, as a person in a stuffy chamber will scarcely notice the stuffiness. But the deteriorating influence due to friction goes on, even if unperceived. And one morning we perceive its ravages, and write a letter to the Telegraph to inquire whether life is worth living, or whether marriage is a failure, or whether men are more polite than women. The proof that friction, in various and varying degrees, is practically conscious in most households, lies in the fact that when we chance on a household where there is no friction, we are startled. We can't recover from the phenomenon. And in describing this household to our friends, we say, "They get on so well together," as if we were saying, "They have wings and can fly. Just fancy! Did you ever hear of such a thing?" 90% of all daily friction is caused by tone, mere tone of voice. Try this experiment. Say, "Oh, you little darling, you sweet pet, you entirely charming creature," to a baby or a dog, but roar these delightful epithets in the tone of saying, "You infernal little nuisance! If I hear another sound, I'll break every bone in your body." The baby will infallibly whimper, and the dog will infallibly mooch off. True, a dog is not a human being, neither is a baby. They cannot understand. It is precisely because they cannot understand and articulate words that the experiment is valuable, for it separates the effect of the tone from the effect of the word spoken. He who speaks, speaks twice. His words convey his thought, and his tone conveys his mental attitude towards the person spoken to. And certainly the attitude, so far as friction goes, is more important than the thought. Your wife may say to you, "I shall buy that hat I spoke to you about." And you may reply, quite sincerely, "As you please." But it will depend on your tone whether you convey, "As you please. I am sympathetically anxious that your innocent caprices should be indulged," or whether you convey, "As you please. Only don't bother me with hats. I am above hats. A great deal too much money is spent in this house on hats. However, I'm helpless." Or whether you convey, "As you please, heart of my heart. But if you would like to be a nice girl, go gently. We're rather tight." I need not elaborate. I am sure of being comprehended. As tone is the expression of attitude, it is, of course, caused by attitude. The frictional tone is chiefly due to that general attitude of blame which I have already condemned as being absurd and unjustifiable. As by constant watchful discipline we gradually lose this silly attitude of blame, so the tone will of itself gradually change. But the two ameliorations can proceed together, and it is a curious thing that an agreeable tone, artificially and deliberately adopted, will influence the mental attitude almost as much as the mental attitude will influence the tone. If you honestly feel resentful against someone, but having understood the foolishness of fury, intentionally mask your fury under a persuasive tone, your fury will at once begin to abate. You will be led into a rational train of thought. You will see that after all the object of your resentment has a right to exist, and that he is neither a doormat nor a scoundrel, and that anyhow nothing is to be gained and much is to be lost by fury. You will see that fury is unworthy of you. Do you remember the gentleness of the tone which you employed after the healing of your first quarrel with a beloved companion? Do you remember the persuasive tone which you used when you wanted to obtain something from a difficult person on whom your happiness depended? Why should not your tone always combine these qualities? Why should you not carefully school your tone? Is it beneath you to ensure the largest possible amount of your own way by the simplest means? Or is there at the back of your mind that peculiarly English and German idea that politeness, sympathy, and respect for another immortal soul would imply deplorable weakness on your part? You say that your happiness does not depend on every person whom you happen to speak to. Yes, it does. Your happiness is always dependent on just that person. Produce friction, and you suffer. Idle to argue that the person has no business to be upset by your tone. You have caused avoidable friction, simply because your machine for dealing with your environment was suffering from pride, ignorance, or thoughtlessness. You say I am making a mountain out of a molehill. No, I am making a mountain out of 10 million molehills. And that is what life does. It is the little but continuous causes that have great effects. I repeat, why not deliberately adopt a gentle, persuasive tone, just to see what the results are? Surely you are not ashamed to be wise. You may smile superiorly as you read this, yet you know very well that more than once you have resolved to use a gentle and persuasive tone on all occasions, and that the sole reason why you had that fearful shindy yesterday with your cousin's sister-in-law was that you had long since failed to keep your resolve. But you were of my mind once, and more than once. What you have to do is to teach the new habit to your brain by daily concentration on it, by forcing your brain to think of nothing else for half an hour of a morning. After a time the brain will begin to remember automatically. For, of course, the explanation of your previous failures is that your brain, undisciplined, merely forgot at the critical moment. The tone was out of your mouth before your brain had waked up. It is necessary to watch as though you were a sentinel, not only against the wrong tone, but against the other symptoms of the attitude of blame, such as the frown. It is necessary to regard yourself constantly and in minute detail. You lie in bed for half an hour and enthusiastically concentrate on this beautiful new scheme of the right tone. You rise, and because you don't achieve a proper elegance of necktie at the first knotting, you frown and swear and clench your teeth. There is a symptom of the wrong attitude towards your environment. You are awake, but your brain isn't. It is in such a symptom that you may judge yourself. And not a trifling symptom either. If you will frown at a necktie, if you will use language to a necktie which no gentleman should use to a necktie, what will you be capable of to a responsible being? Yes, it is very difficult, but it can be done. End of chapter 8.